Have you ever wondered why the truth hurts so much? Why mental clarity, instead of bringing immediate comfort, often leaves us with a sharp feeling of isolation? It is curious how many of us spend our lives seeking answers, but when we finally find some, we feel a weight we did not expect. We realize that awakening is not just a moment of glorified enlightenment, as spiritual narratives make us believe, but a process of separation. You begin to see patterns that others do not see, to question systems that others accept, and this creates an invisible but palpable distance. Perhaps you have already experienced this. That feeling of sitting at a dinner table with family or friends, listening to conversations about politics, economics, or technology, and realizing that you inhabit a completely different reality, even though you are physically present. That moment when you want to share a deeper perspective, but the words die in your throat because you know there is no shared conceptual structure to receive them. This is the peculiar loneliness of awakening. And despite what modern gurus promise, this feeling is not a sign of spiritual failure, but an inevitable aspect of the journey that almost no one mentions. Today, we will explore this hidden face of expanded consciousness, the distance that arises when you begin to see the world as it is, not as we were told it should be. And more importantly, how to navigate this experience without succumbing to despair or arrogance. To understand the price of awakening in a sleeping society, we first need to look at the historical context of human consciousness. For most of history, humans operated within relatively unified systems of meaning. In Paleolithic tribal societies, practically everyone shared the same animistic worldview. There were no existential crises because meaning was woven into the very structure of the community and its narratives. Even in great agricultural civilizations, despite their social complexities, there existed a dominant religious narrative that offered a shared framework of reality. A peasant in ancient Egypt, for example, could suffer tremendously, but would rarely question the very fabric of reality or the fundamental meaning of their existence. The structure of meaning was provided, not individually discovered. This is a critical distinction for understanding our current situation. In pre-modern societies, you could suffer intensely for countless reasons, but rarely because of the complete absence of meaning or the painful awareness of being awake while others sleep. Modernity changed this fundamentally, starting with the Enlightenment, with the gradual dissolution of unifying religious narratives. A new paradigm emerged. The individual was positioned as the primary unit of meaning and experience. Authority shifted from external institutions to internal subjectivity. This shift, although it brought extraordinary freedoms, also placed upon the individual an unprecedented burden. Now, each person must find or build their own meaning in a universe increasingly described as mechanical and indifferent. Science explained the hows of the universe with impressive precision, but remained silent about the whys. This even this historical development is crucial for understanding why awakening today occurs in a radically different context. In ancient contemplative traditions, Awakening took place within a community of practitioners who shared a paradigm. A Buddhist monk awakening in the 5th century did not face an ontological abyss between his experience and that of his monastic companions. There was a shared language for the experience, an interpretive context, a community of practice. Awakening, although deeply personal, was not isolationist. Today, however, awakening often happens in a cultural vacuum. A person can have profound insights into the nature of reality, the mind, or the social systems that shape us, but around them exists an ocean of consciousness shaped primarily by market forces, engagement algorithms, and consumer narratives. The contrast is dizzying. Imagine clearly perceiving how social networks are reconfiguring human cognition, how growth metrics are exhausting natural systems, or how our political identities are often manipulated by simplistic narratives, while most people around you remain captured precisely by these patterns without questioning. This is not an awakening into a higher world of shared consciousness, but an awakening to the very nature of collective illusions that continue to envelop those you love. Let us now examine the central transformation that occurs during this process of contemporary awakening. The deepest change is not in the specific content of understanding, but in the fundamental relationship with knowledge itself. The sleeping person, so to speak, confuses the map with the territory. They take their mental representations, their concepts and narratives about reality as the reality itself. This is a state of unconscious identification with thought. The initial awakening often involves a process of de-identification where the person begins to recognize the constructed and contingent nature of their own thought structures. There is a growing recognition that our deepest certainties are in fact approximate models, not absolute truths. This understanding can be liberating, but also deeply disorienting. It means that the foundations on which we build our identities and understandings are more fluid and arbitrary than we could ever imagine. Imagine discovering that the ground beneath your feet is not solid concrete, but a complex web of constantly shifting relations. This perception has implications far beyond mere intellect, reaching the very foundations of personal identity. Here it is worth pausing to ask you directly, in which moments of your life have you felt most intensely this distance between your perception and that of others? Those moments when you saw beyond appearances and were surprised by the inability of others to see the same? I know that many of us keep these experiences to ourselves, perhaps out of fear of seeming arrogant or alienated in a world that values belonging and conformity above truth. But here, in this space, your honest reflection is welcome. Share in the comments, I perceived this distance in consciousness when. Your experience may resonate deeply with others who silently cross the same inner territory, showing that we are not as alone as it sometimes seems in this bewildering journey. Modern technology and the structure of digital society have dramatically expanded both the possibilities and the challenges of awakening. On one hand, we have unprecedented access to knowledge, perspectives, and transformative practices. Anyone with internet access can encounter the deepest teachings of contemplative traditions, the most incisive critiques of social systems, or the latest scientific discoveries about the nature of reality. This is an extraordinary development in human history. However, at the same time, technology has created unprecedented mechanisms of attention, capture, and cognitive manipulation. Our devices and platforms are not neutral tools, but environments designed to shape our behavior in specific directions, generally aligned with market imperatives. As algorithms learn to predict and influence our choices with increasing precision, the very notion of individual agency is subtly eroded. Awake to this reality, you begin to see the digital world not only as an extension of reality, but as a carefully engineered architecture of influence. You perceive how your own cognition is affected by patterns of technological use, how your attention is fragmented, how your desires are subtly shaped. Meanwhile, many around you remain in an unexamined state of acceptance of these structures. The paradox becomes pungent. The same technologies that facilitated your awakening also work tirelessly to neutralize it, to reintegrate your expanded consciousness back into predictable patterns of consumption and behavior. This recognition leads us to one of the central paradoxes of awakening. The more you understand the constructed and conditioned nature of social reality, the more you perceive your own participation in these constructions. There is no neutral observer, no privileged place outside the system from which one can judge objectively. Even your perception of collective illusion is itself shaped by specific conditioning, cognitive limitations, and cultural influences. This is a critical moment in the awakening process, where many stumble into a new form of illusion, a sense of spiritual or intellectual superiority. The partially awakened person often develops what we might call the arrogance of awakening, the conviction that they finally see clearly while others remain deceived. It is an understandable position, but fundamentally contradictory, because it fails to apply the same critical scrutiny to its own perspective. The deepest awakening involves the recognition of one's own participation in the systems. One criticizes of the inevitable partiality of one's own vision. This is not hopeless relativism, but epistemic humility, the recognition that all human understanding is provisional and perspectival. Another paradox of awakening is that while it can create a painful sense of separation, it also opens the possibility of a more authentic connection. When you no longer completely identify with your mental constructions, when you recognize the element of play in the identity you present to the world, something surprising happens. You become capable of a different kind of encounter with others. No longer so invested in defending particular positions or projecting a specific image, you can be present in more direct and open ways. Interaction ceases to be primarily an exchange of information or an exercise in self-presentation, becoming a field of shared presence. This is a subtle but profound shift. The person who has gone through the process of de-identification with their mental structures can paradoxically connect more deeply because they are no longer so limited by the filter of their self-narratives. Here we find another fascinating contradiction. The recognition of fundamental separation can lead to an experience of deeper connection. The question that inevitably arises is, how can we navigate this challenging territory? How can we inhabit a world where our deepest perceptions are not easily shareable with many of those we love? One approach that frequently emerges in contemporary spiritual discourse is the withdrawal into communities of awakened or conscious people. Although this strategy has its value, it also carries significant risks. Isolated communities of people who share similar perspectives often develop their own forms of conformity and dogmatism. The absence of intellectual friction and the comfort of consensus can ironically lead to new forms of sleep, now masked as awakening. Perhaps a more fruitful approach is what we could call bilingual presence. Just as someone fluent in 2 languages can move between different linguistic worlds, adapting their expression without compromising their understanding, the awakened person can learn to inhabit different contexts of consciousness without losing their fundamental clarity. This does not mean pretending agreement where none exists, but developing the ability to translate deep insights into languages that different people can receive, respecting their current positions on the spectrum of awakening. This capacity for translation is not merely a pragmatic skill, but an expression of authentic compassion. It recognizes that awakening is not an instant achievement, but a gradual and often non-linear process. Just as you would not expect a child to understand advanced calculus before mastering basic arithmetic, it makes no sense to expect someone to comprehend insights that presuppose experiences or cognitive developments they have not yet had. True compassion does not lie in judging others for not seeing what you see, but in meeting them exactly where they are, offering what they can receive now, knowing that each person follows their own path of development at their own pace. This approach recognizes a fundamental truth. We are all simultaneously awake in some areas and deeply asleep in others. Awakening is not a binary state, but a multidimensional spectrum. The person who clearly perceives social structures may be blind to their own emotional patterns. One with deep clarity about the nature of consciousness may remain trapped in limiting views about relationships or life purpose. There is also an ethical dimension in the process of awakening that is rarely openly discussed. As your perception expands, you inevitably face the question, what should I do with this understanding? What is my responsibility before a world that seems structurally committed to patterns that I recognize as harmful? Here, again, traps arise. One is what we could call enlightened nihilism. The conclusion that since all structures are arbitrary constructions, no action really matters. This position, although understandable as an initial response to the collapse of certainties, represents a form of evasion, an abdication of the responsibility that accompanies expanded consciousness. On the opposite extreme is the messianism of awakening, the passionate conviction that your mission is to awaken everyone else regardless of whether they are receptive already. This approach, although well-intentioned, often arises more from the ego disguised as enlightenment than from genuine compassion, and rarely produces the desired results. A third, more sustainable way is what we could call localized conscious action. This approach recognizes the limits of what any individual can change, but does not use those limits as an excuse for inaction. Instead, it focuses on acting with clarity and integrity in the spheres where one has direct influence, without the need for dramatic conversions or grandiose results. Let us also consider the broader implications of awakening for our civilization as a whole. We live in a moment of unprecedented converging crises: climate emergencies, biodiversity collapse, extreme inequalities, accelerated technological disruption, social polarization, and the collapse of shared meaning. All these challenges intertwine into a complex knot that no conventional approach seems capable of untying. Many of these problems arise precisely from the type of fragmented and reductionist consciousness that characterized industrial modernity. If this is correct, then awakening is not just a matter of personal achievement, but possibly an evolutionary imperative. Perhaps we need, as a species, a fundamental transformation in our way of perceiving and relating to the world in order to successfully navigate the dangerous transition we face. Seen from this angle, individual awakening acquires a significance that transcends the merely personal. Each person who expands their consciousness, who develops the ability to perceive complex systems and interrelationships, who cultivates compassion beyond the boundaries of tribal identity, contributes to the emergence of new collective possibilities. This is not a process that can be forced or artificially accelerated, but it can be nurtured and supported. Human history is dotted with moments of radical transformation in collective consciousness. The cognitive revolution of the Upper Paleolithic, which made symbolic thinking and complex language possible. The agricultural revolution, which radically transformed our relationship with space and time. The emergence of the great axial religions, which introduced new conceptions of transcendence and universal ethics. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on critical reason and individual autonomy. Each of these transitions involved not just new contents of thought, but new structures of consciousness, new ways of perceiving and interpreting reality. Perhaps we are on the threshold of another of these great transitions, a movement toward forms of consciousness that transcend the limitations of modern individualism, subject-object separation, disciplinary fragmentation, without regressing into pre-modern forms of undifferentiated fusion or unquestioned authority. What this emerging consciousness might look like is not yet entirely clear, but its contours can already be glimpsed at the frontiers of science, philosophy, contemplative practices, and innovative social movements. Returning to the personal level, how can we navigate the challenges of awakening without succumbing to isolation or resignation? First, it is crucial to recognize that you are not alone in this experience, even when it feels like it. All around the world, people are going through similar processes of expanding consciousness and facing similar challenges. Finding or creating communities where your perceptions can be shared and refined, where you can be fully seen and understood, is vital. These do not need to be physical communities. In the digital age, meaningful connections can be formed across vast distances. Second, the deliberate cultivation of practices that deepen and stabilize awakening is essential. Without regular practices, deep insights can dissipate, gradually being reabsorbed by the dominant patterns of social cognition. These practices vary enormously from formal meditation to artistic engagement, immersion in nature, or Socratic dialogue. The important thing is that they regularly interrupt the automatic patterns of thought and perception, creating spaces where new possibilities can emerge. Third, the balance between compassion and clarity needs to be continually recalibrated. Clarity without compassion easily becomes cold and distant. Compassion without clarity can be sentimental and ineffective. Together, they create a field of presence that can respond with wisdom to the complexities of life. Another essential dimension of sustainable awakening is the cultivation of what we could call non-contingent joy. In a culture obsessed with happiness as a result of specific external circumstances, awakening offers the possibility of a joy that does not depend on conditions being exactly as we wish. This is not a form of toxic dissociation or spiritual denial, where real problems are ignored in the name of superficial positivity. On the contrary, it is the discovery that even in the midst of difficulties and challenges, there exists a dimension of consciousness that remains untouched, a space of presence and openness that is not defined by external circumstances. Cultivating familiarity with this space is not escapism, but a crucial source of resilience. It allows you to remain engaged with the real challenges of the world without being completely consumed by them. The person who has found this internal source of well-being has more, not less, to offer in terms of effective service to others, because their action is not constantly distorted by the desperate need to change external conditions in order to find peace. As we advance in this exploration, it is also important to recognize the role of the body in the process of awakening. In Western philosophical tradition, especially after Descartes, awakening was often conceived primarily in cognitive terms as a matter of intellectual clarity or conceptual understanding. This approach ignores the fundamental fact that human consciousness is embodied, that our cognition is inseparable from our corporality. Authentic awakening involves not only new understandings, but new ways of inhabiting the body, new qualities of sensory presence. In fact, many of the limiting structures that restrict our consciousness are not merely ideas or beliefs, but patterns deeply inscribed in our nervous systems, our emotional responses, our physical postures, working directly with the body, whether through embodied contemplative practices, somatic arts, or other approaches that refine sensory presence, can be a crucial dimension of the awakening process. This is an area where Eastern contemplative traditions, with their rich understanding of the energetic and physical dimensions of consciousness, have much to offer contemporary seekers. A particularly challenging dimension of awakening in our time is navigating the structures of digital information. Never before have human beings been exposed to such a volume and speed of information, much of it designed specifically to capture and direct attention. In this environment, even people with considerable inner development can find their attention fragmented, their cognition overloaded, their presence eroded. Awakening in the 21st century, therefore, necessarily involves developing new disciplines of relationship with technology. This does not mean Luddite rejection, but conscious engagement, the cultivation of practices that allow technology to serve authentic human development rather than the opposite. How do you relate your attention, this most precious resource, with the streams of information that constantly compete for it? How do you discern what deserves your engagement in a world of endless stimuli? How do you maintain depth in a culture of perpetual distraction? These are not peripheral questions, but central to the contemporary process of awakening. The truly awakened person is not the one who completely escapes the flows of modern information, but the one who has learned to navigate them with discernment and intentionality, maintaining clarity and presence, even amid complexity. As we approach the end of this exploration, let us return to the question of the cost of awakening. Yes, there is a real price to be paid for seeing beyond the comfortable illusions that sustain much of contemporary social life. The feeling of separation, the impossibility of fully communicating your deepest perceptions to many of those you love, the weight of clearly perceiving problems for which there are no simple solutions, the responsibility that accompanies expanded understanding. These are all genuinely challenging aspects of the path, but there is also a much greater cost in remaining asleep, in continuing to unconsciously participate in systems that cause unnecessary suffering to yourself, to others, to the more than human world. And there is a possibility that emerges only through awakening, the possibility of a way of being that is simultaneously more lucid and more compassionate, more autonomous and more connected, more capable both of critical discernment and of genuine wonder. This possibility is not guaranteed, but it is available to those willing to face the challenges of the process with courage, humility, and perseverance. Awakening is not a final destination, but a continuous journey, a process that unfolds throughout life. There is no point at which someone can honestly say, I am completely awake, my work is finished. The more deeply you enter the territory of expanded consciousness, the more you realize how much remains to be explored, how much is still veiled by subtle conditioning, persistent blind spots, unrecognized limitations. This understanding could be discouraging if seen through the lens of perfection as a final destination. But seen from another perspective, it is profoundly liberating. It means that you are freed from the pressure of reaching some final state of perfect enlightenment, free to engage in the process moment by moment, finding satisfaction not in some final accomplishment, but in the very journey of unfolding and discovery. And perhaps this is the deepest wisdom that emerges from the awakening process. Not some particular set of understandings or realizations, but a way of being that remains open, curious, willing to be surprised, to grow, to be transformed by the encounter with the unknown. If these reflections have resonated with your own experiences of awakening in a world that often seems asleep, in limiting patterns of thought and behavior, know that you are not alone on this journey. By subscribing to this channel, you will connect with a growing community of people who share many of the same questions, challenges, and aspirations. Each week, we explore together the complexities of contemporary awakening, offering not simplistic answers or prescriptive formulas, but perspectives that can illuminate your own unique path. This is not only a space for intellectual analysis, but for honest contemplation of the real challenges we face as human beings in this extraordinary moment in history. Join us in this ongoing exploration. Subscribe so we can continue together this essential conversation about how to navigate the awakening process with wisdom, compassion, and integrity, finding ways to inhabit this complex world that honor both our growing clarity and our connection with all those who share this journey with us, regardless of where they find themselves on the spectrum of awakening.
Democracies are safe. You can have different governments with this policy or that policy and experiment. As long as there are these checks and balances and the ultimate ability to replace the government, then the democracy is safe. The danger in every democracy, and this goes back thousands of years, in a democracy you give one person or one party the power for a limited duration on condition they afterwards give it back to the people and the people can make a different choice next time. The danger is, what if you give power to someone who then doesn't give it back? They use the power they have to take over the institutions, to rig the elections, to control the media, and then you can never replace them. That was always the big dangers in democracy. You can have strong institutions, but government ultimately is able to corrupt all these institutions. So people should make wise choices and be very careful not to give power to people who might not want to give it back.